Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello everyone, welcome to Healing the Spirit. I am excited to dedicate this episode to the undefined throat and the open throat. So in human design, there are 9 energy centers in the body graph, and one of them is the throat center. And the throat center is related to manifestation, to communication, to expressions. And as with all the centers in human design, we can have it be defined and we can have it be undefined, or we can have it completely open. I'm going to talk more all about this, but before, let me read the question that came in that inspired this episode. So this is coming from my friend, collaborator, colleague, and teacher, Kelsey Rose Tortorici, who has been on the podcast. And you can listen to my incredible conversation with Kelsey. It was so good. And Kelsey shared this question with me. I would love to hear you talk more about your process with your undefined throat over time. I find it to sometimes be a big stuck point for people early in their exploration of human design. I think there can be a lot of shame wrapped up in throat stuff, specifically, so I'm always seeking more intentional and compassionate ways to point out the tendencies of the not self in the center. I'd love to hear about your lived experience deconditioning that center, because you're such a lovely example to me of someone who embodies the potential for potent impact through the undefined throat. First of all, thank you, Kelsey. That question and your very kind words made my heart sing, quite literally. And yeah, I'm not going to lie. I think that having an undefined throat can be really challenging. So there was this study done, I think in the early 90s, where a bunch of human design geeks try to figure out how many percent of the population have an undefined or open throat versus how many people have a defined throat, right? And they did this for all the centers in the human design body graph. And I think the study came out and it was like only 20% of people in the sample that they were running through their software actually have undefined throat. So I feel like a lot of advice that floats out there about the undefined throat is not really rooted in reality, because the beautiful thing about human design is there's this theory or the system aspect to human design, and then there's also the lived experience. You know what Ra Uru Hu, the founder of human design, calls the experiment, right? And so I think that just like how for me, as someone who is a sacral being, I can never fully, with authority, talk about the experience of not having my sacral definition. Similarly, I think there's a lot of people out there talking about the undefined or the open throat while they themselves have a defined throat, and I'm not saying they're wrong necessarily, but there are probably nuances that are missing in the conversation because not a lot of people have an undefined or open throat. So at this point, you might be asking, okay, Jonathan, you've been talking about this thing. Can you explain a little bit more about what the undefined and open throat means? So let me go over kind of the more technical aspect of human design, just to give you a sense of what it might mean to have an undefined or open throat. So if you go on one of those websites where you can pull up your human design chart, where you can enter your birth information and see your chart, you might see that the different centers in the body graph, if they have a color or they're filled in, that's what we call a defined center, right? That means that center is connected to another center that's also through a channel. And so those two centers that are connected would be called defined in human design, right? And then you will have centers that are, or you might have some centers that are undefined, meaning that it's not colored in. However, there are hanging gates, right, represented by the numbers around the center that are activated by a planet. And then you might also have an open center, which means there's no activation at all, right? So if you're seeing a center that is not colored in and none of the numbers around it have like this, uh, yeah, none of them are colored in, that means that that center is completely open, right? And so undefined and open centers can only be defined by transit in human design or in relationships. So if you're around someone who has a definition in that center, you will kind of be in this experience of feeling their definition, and in the composite chart, right, in the relationship chart, you will find a kind of definition there through that relationship. um, but when you have a completely open center, there's a lower likelihood of definition because it will only then be defined when the other person in the relationship or the transit, right, is fully defined in the throat center. So anyways, these are all pretty technical things. If you want to learn more, I recommend that you take human design classes. I think Human Design Collective, which is John Cole and Amy Lee, have incredible classes. Kelsey Rose Tortorici also has an incredible class called Living Your Design that gives you kind of a baseline of what all of this means and can probably explain them a little bit better than I can. So when it comes to the experience of having an undefined center, it's very important to understand that the undefined center doesn't mean that you don't have access to whatever that center represents, right? Which in this case, because we're talking about the throat talks about creativity, it talks about manifestation, it talks about having an impact in the world, it talks about self expression. When you have an undefined throat, it doesn't mean that you cannot manifest, it doesn't mean that you can't speak. Obviously, because I'm speaking to the microphone right now, right? It doesn't mean that you can't um express your beautiful creative being out in the world. It simply means that you probably don't have a consistent access to your own information through the center, right? Through the throat. That some of the impulses that you are feeling through your throat, or with regards to the areas of life, the human experience that is governed by the throat, perhaps some of them are not completely yours, because what human design theory says about undefined and open centers um, is that undefined and open centers are able to pick up on or reflect their environment or the people that they're in relationship with, the energy that is present there, and they can also absorb and then amplify, right? So you might not have access to your own consistent way of using the throat when you have an undefined or open throat. It certainly doesn't mean that you don't have a voice, though, right? Um, and some of the things that I've heard about the open and undefined throat is that when you have an open or undefined throat, you can't manifest or you can't lead, you can't use your words in order to express yourself, right? There's all kinds of really strange things out there that I hear about it. There's also, I've heard people say that when you have an undefined throat, you don't have a distinctive or a distinguishable voice. I mean, this is kind of baloney in my opinion. I mean, maybe that's true for some people. Maybe some people are kind of this chameleon-like creature that goes out there and sound different in every circumstances they find themselves in. But I don't necessarily find that to be true for myself. Maybe there's a little bit of variance, right? Depending on who I'm talking to, depending on the environment, depending on the topic, right? But it doesn't mean that people can't recognize my voice, you know? And if you're listening to this podcast, you would probably agree. Like, you probably can hear me on a different person's podcast and recognize that it's my voice, right? It's so strange, some of the things that you hear out there spoken about this particular center. One of my favorite examples, when it comes to celebrities and famous people, with regards to the undefined throat, is Sarah McLachlan. So some of you may know Sarah McLachlan, who was very famous throughout the 90s and early 2000s. You may know her song Angel. You may know her song Adia, right? She wrote quite a number of hits around the early 2000s era. And Sarah McLachlan actually has an undefined throat. This was I have an interesting story about how I know about this because I literally was talking to John and Amy in one of the classes about my own undefined throat. And we were talking specifically about the gates that are activated in my design with regards to my undefined throat. And then somewhere along the way, I started talking about Sarah McLachlan. I was talking about how, as a musician for me, and especially as a singer, I feel quite viscerally within my throat, like my actual literal throat, when it's time for me to sing and to share some of my materials. And very often, it doesn't feel like the impulse or the desire is coming purely from me. Often, it feels like my throat is kind of doing this unconscious thing of scanning my environment and checking to see if the material that I wrote, right, the music that I wrote, the music that I want to sing through my voice is going to have an impact or going to have a resonance or is needed by the environment. Which is such an interesting experience because for many, many years after I released my album in 2019, I was really beating myself up for not recording another album. There was this part of me, this more mental voice that's kind of telling me, if you want to be seen as a devoted or dedicated musician, you need to keep making stuff, right? And then in the middle of class, I was talking about how that doesn't feel true for me. And I mentioned Sarah McLachlan, who has not released an album in a very long time. And if you follow her career, you can see that she really has this huge gap between one album and the next. And then we looked up her chart, and lo and behold, she has an undefined throat, But I think she's such a great example to bring in here at the front of our conversation because clearly this is a very successful singer, right? She really made a career using her voice. So if you have an undefined or open throat, it absolutely doesn't mean that you can't be known for your throat or for your voice or for your creative expression. That's just complete baloney. It's possible. Right. It is absolutely possible because Sarah McLachlan did it. I'm not saying that I'm Sarah McLachlan or you are, but clearly there's someone out there who's doing it, you know? And the way that she's doing it, right, is not really what we would consider industry standard, which I think is really interesting. So, um, another thing I want to mention before I go further is there's also sometimes an advice that I've seen in multiple forums or in different conversations about the undefined throat, where people say if you have an undefined or open throat, you need to be invited by other people to speak. I don't know if this is true, based on my experience. I've certainly had periods where I hold myself back because I could tell that when I just willy-nilly initiate and use my voice to talk about things, even though I can sense that maybe the environment is not quite yet ready for it, I can say that I have a not great experience when that happens. Like, usually, my throat, I don't know if it's physically or energetically, can kind of feel, is this going to land well with this group? It kind of has that capability. And also sometimes I still want to say the things I want to say, and I think constantly putting yourself in a position where you feel like you need other people to invite you to say something can be very disempowering. So I'm not saying that's an advice that one needs to knock off completely, but I will say I think it's important to be nuanced with that advice, right? It's probably true that you will be better received if you speak after a specific invitation by others. However, I don't think that you need to be sacrificing your self expression just so other people can hear you. Sometimes we use our voice and we express ourselves simply because we want to, simply because we do have something to say. And I think there's something here about releasing our attachment to timing and releasing our attachment to when the things that we say actually land for people. I'm going to get into this in much more detail a little bit later on. But first and foremost, I want to bring in kind of a systemic piece here, right? Before we talk about my experience, before we talk about the undefined throat, at least from Jonathan's experience specifically, I want to talk about the larger context that we are in, right? I think it's important to recognize that, especially if you live in the United States or you interact with the American culture in general, it's a very verbal culture. I grew up in Jakarta in Indonesia, and I have a Gemini moon. I was born when the moon was in Gemini, so I was a talkative child. I was a very talkative child, especially by Asian standards. I had a lot of words to say. They were not always well received. And what surprised me when I moved to the US was how much more words people were using. And people were always kind of explaining what they're doing verbally, which is not something that I used to hear back home. And I know that Indonesian culture is not the only culture that's not as verbal, right? Many, many cultures around the world, especially when they're not Western cultures, tend to be um, we tend to communicate through various means. We don't only communicate through our words. We also communicate with our body language, with eye contact. We also communicate through energy. This is something that we do all the time as living beings. We communicate through energy. You've probably communicated through your energy to your pets, right? Because they don't always understand English. So I think it's important to place this discussion in the context of how, especially if you live in America, but in general, a lot of Western culture are quite verbal, right? And so there can be a lot of fear around if I don't have the right words to describe myself or describe my experience or communicate myself to people in a way that's precise, then I'm going to be in trouble. People are going to think I'm stupid. People are going to think I am not educated, right? Which is another thing that's actually really part of the colonial culture. Part of the colonial culture is imposing the supremacy of standardized language, the supremacy of the written word, right? And the supremacy of people who are articulate and really good at explaining the concepts and the experiences that they are moving through, which is not a universal marker of intelligence. For example, in Indonesia, um, and I don't want to speak for all of Indonesia because Indonesia is a huge country with a lot of different diverse cultures. But in Jakarta, let's just say, where I grew up, yes, people definitely value when someone is very articulate, someone is good with their words. I think it's safe to say that when someone can use their words in a very effective and precise way and have this ability to have a certain kind of impact on their environment through their voice and their words, um, life moves more smoothly for these people. However, intelligence is not purely verbal. There are other kinds of intelligences too. You've probably even had a friend like this, right? There are people who are just such great conversationalists because they're not always talking about themselves, but rather they have this ability to deeply listen to another person and then to um, ask really relevant, pertinent, and interesting questions, right? And that is also a sign of intelligence. That is a sign of a kind of intelligence that the person who's so good at monologues and soliloquies are not always able to tap into, right? The ability to really listen to what the other person is saying and then to say something in return or even respond in a way through one's body language, through one's presence, that can make the other person feel more at ease, or feel more able to open up is such a skill, that I think within the context of the American culture that's so obsessed with um, public speaking, being articulate, looking really impressive in front of a camera, is not always valued and priced, right? So that's the first thing I want to bring in. The second thing I want to bring in is that shame around throat or expressions of the voice are experienced by people who have all kinds of design. I have a lot of friends and family members who have a defined throat, and they also experience a lot of shame. So I think shame around the throat area and around expressing oneself through the voice, through words, is an experience that a lot of people have. It's not just because if you have an undefined throat and or an open throat, and you are experiencing the emotional mm, challenges and maybe even blockages that come from that shame, I just want you to know that you're not alone. You're going to find a lot of people with defined throat who also has challenges with their throat. Um, One of the things I found to be really helpful in terms of contextualizing this is to zoom out of the human design system a little bit and the human design theory and to talk about the voice in general. So, the physical voice is really a crystallization of our unique frequency, right? You can think about this in terms of our life force energy. So, a lot of cultures, a lot of different spiritual frameworks, or I don't even think it's a spiritual, I think a lot of culture frameworks talk about the idea of the life force. Um, it's called the chi in the Chinese cosmology. It's considered prana in the Indian or the Vedic cosmology, or ki in the Japanese cosmology, right? So um, the life force energy can be defined loosely as the energy that runs through our system and continues to run um, from the moment we were born until the time that we pass away, right? In this physical body. And so the life force energy is kind of this energy that is really running through our own system and produced and reproduced by our system, right? It only exists within our body and within our energetic body. And one of the ways to think about the physical voice is that it's a crystallization, it's one of the crystallization of that unique life force energy, right? From the standpoint of biology, we can also think about our voice as this really unique combination of different parts of our anatomy working together to make a sound, right? My voice is unique, and the Jonathan voice only exists for Jonathan and through Jonathan because I have a very specific shape of my larynx, of my vocal folds, of the size of my lungs, of my tongue, of my soft palate, right? And so your voice is unique. And whenever we run into anything that is unique, we are always then, as humans, because we are social animals, faced with this challenge of how do we maintain, or how do we make sense, or how do we allow our uniqueness to belong um, within the greater web of belonging to other humans and belonging to life, right? And um, one of the definitions of culture that I've been thinking about is kind of an agreed upon set of defining things, talking about things, and relating to things, right? When we talk about the American culture, for example, we're really talking about some commonly accepted definitions, some commonly accepted ways of being that will become the marker of a specific group of people or a specific place, right? You can tell the difference between an American person versus a Japanese person or an Indian person or an Indonesian person because maybe they speak different languages, right? Language is a part of culture. Maybe they eat slightly different foods or they eat differently, right? That's also part of culture. And so there is something about culture that has to do with conforming. And so, whenever we are looking at parts of our lived experience that's unique, that's singular, it's always going to brush up against the larger culture, right? Um, I remember as a teenager, actually, I used to love singing in public. I used to go to record stores, CD stores at that time, for those of you old enough to know what CDs are. And if there's a song that was playing that I really like, I would just sing along, you know? And I wasn't one of those kids who would just like sing along to myself. Like I would like let my voice be heard, you know? And I remember there was this one time when my mom came to me and she was kind of like, "Hey kid, you know that other people can hear you, right?" And I just remember like this wash of shame, you know, that was really moving through me as if I did something wrong. And I don't think this experience is um, unique to me, right? And it's not like my mom had any bad intention or she wanted me to feel bad about my voice for the rest of my life. But there is something about like, these are just some of the things that we don't do, right? Like if I walk around New York and I just started singing really loudly, people will look at me kind of funny, you know, because most people don't do that, right? And even if I have a really beautiful voice, people will be like, "What is going on? Is this a performance? Are they asking for money?" Right? Um, there's something about standing out with our own voice that's risky. You know, that's just always going to be a little bit uncomfortable. The other piece I want to bring in here around a very human um, experience of feeling some sort of shame or embarrassment or weirdness around our throat and the expressions of our voice is the reality that there are also physical tensions that are connected to the experience of the voice, right? So, in order for me to speak in English in a language that you, the listeners, can understand, I have to contort my facial muscles and my body in a certain way. Or maybe I don't have to, but it's just part of what I've learned along the way, right? So this is something that I was talking to with my friend Marissa Michelson the other day about how we learn to speak and also to sing for that matter through imitation and through observation. And so if the person that we're learning to speak from or to sing from, be that our caretakers or our voice teachers, if they hold certain micro tensions in their jaw or in their throat, or maybe somewhere in their face or in their back, it's very likely that we unconsciously also mirror them or we pick up on that as well. Because again, we learn to speak and to sing through imitating them, you know, so we try to make uh, a very similar sound. And in making that sound, we also maybe unconsciously moved our micro muscles in a way that is similar to them, you know? So that's something to think about. And maybe a final note I will throw in here is a few years ago, I took voice training. It was the somatic voice work training, a method that was created by Jeannie Lovetri. And in the training, they showed us this video, which you can YouTube, by the way, of the vocal folds. So this video specifically was showing what the vocal folds were doing when someone was speaking, what the vocal folds were doing when someone is singing a low note or a high note, right? And it was so interesting because as I was watching that video, I was like, wow, the vocal folds really looks like the vulva, you know? And it was so interesting because at that time I was teaching astrology and I was specifically preparing a lesson on Venus. And so it makes me think about the connection between Libra and Taurus, right? Libra and Taurus are both signs that are ruled by Venus, and Taurus speaks more to this primal expression, using the voice in a primal way, right? And Libra speaks more to the refined expression of the voice that is maybe more artful, And when we think about our voice and our pelvis and our sexuality, I think there's really powerful connections there that we can think about and that we can contemplate on. Okay, so let me talk about my lived experience with deconditioning shame around my throat center. So let me maybe begin by talking about the not self experience, right? The not self specifically through the throat. I experience the not self as a kind of pain. Usually it's the experience of putting something out using my voice, receiving feedback from the environment, right? Or from the audience, positive or negative. And then the not self experience to me is associated with this feeling of, that's not it. That doesn't feel true. What I just said or what I just did felt like it wasn't coming from me. And that feels very different to me than the experience of like, oh, I just said something, I expressed something, I did my best, it landed the way it landed, but I wanted to just express myself, right? There is something around how, especially with an undefined or open throat, there is the possibility of having the experience of overriding one's own authority by speaking at all costs, right? It's almost like that sensation or that urge to get a word in no matter what is, to me, part of the undefined throat experience. Like, it can feel like there's a lot of pressure for me to say something, even though if I really take a step back, I can feel that maybe it's not the right time yet, or maybe there's not a kind of receptivity, but there's this feeling of like, I have to say something, which is so interesting because in hindsight, when I look back, oftentimes that feeling was probably running through the room. And I was just really allowing that energy to move through my undefined throat. There's also the other end of the spectrum of the experience, which is not speaking at all. I've been through periods where I feel like, what's even the point? Nobody's going to listen to what I have to say. Nobody really cares, or I have to say it a number of times. I have to repeat what I have to say over and over again. What's the point of even speaking? Like, I'm just going to sit in a corner and sulk and not say anything unless someone invites me to say something, right? That's one version of the experience. The other version of the experience is maybe a little less bratty. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, by the way, but it's maybe a little bit less dejected, but more this feeling of confusion. And I imagine that those of you listening who have an open throat may have this experience as well, where I sometimes feel like, for example, nowadays people really love speaking through voice memos, and sometimes I like it too, but there are times when I receive a friend's voice memo and I just don't know what to say in response. Like, I feel that without the real time connection that I have with this person, or the ability to kind of get feedback from them in real time, be that through the noises that they're making or the facial expressions that they're making, or even just in general, like feeling the vibe, right, that we share in real time, I have found it to be very difficult to just kind of start talking to a microphone, at least at certain points in my life, And so I think for a lot of for the undefined throat, it can be much easier for us to communicate when we are able to have a two-way conversation with the other person. When we're able to gauge if what we said made sense or if what we said is landing for them. And it's interesting because, again, to bring in the cultural piece, there can be this prevalent thought form or this prevalent belief within very verbal cultures like the United States culture, where the idea is that authenticity is you saying what is in your heart no matter what, right? Like, how many Disney movies do we need to tell us that just say what's in your heart, man? Like, that's such an American thing, actually. That's a very, very, it's very cultural. And I think the reason why I brought in the culture piece is because I think, especially if you have an undefined throat, if you have an open throat, it's really important to understand that you live within a culture that makes the pressure to speak up, the pressure to verbalize, the pressure to make sense of it through your words, and then to communicate it with the people around you much more intense than probably is necessary, because you live within a culture that's basically a pressure cooker, you know? So yeah, I think there's kind of this idea, right, that the authentic or the genuine person is able to tune into their heart and like always express what's in their heart at all times. And for me, it's been really helpful to really question that belief, right? Because sometimes authenticity for me personally, and I imagine this might be true for people who have an undefined or open throat, looks like being really quiet, saying nothing, letting my speech have different rhythms. My speech is not always going to be this measured, consistent flow. My speech will sometimes be a little slower and sometimes a little bit faster, depending on what I'm saying. It has different lightness or intensity. It has this agility. And I think that's actually really beautiful, right? Like, you wouldn't, if you see an athlete who's very agile, I guess it depends on what they do, but agility is always something that we can use to our advantage, that we can wield to our advantage. And so the first step, though, is to unshame that agility, right? To not feel like that agility is taking away from one's own lived experience. And so what I found is, in the process of deconditioning around my undefined throat, that there's a middle ground. I don't always have to be invited to say something, but rather what I can do is to be a bit more playful with what I'm saying, right? I can go ahead and say the thing and really own it, and then give the room a chance to respond to me. So um when I think about the superpower of the undefined or the open throat, I think about this archetype, right, of this teacher who is in front of the class, who is able to pick up on what the class is needing, to pick up on what their students are needing, and then to be able to, throughout their teaching, find really well timed moments of pause to let the students marinate what they're saying, and then maybe come up with their own opinion, come up with their own view, come up with questions, right? There's spaciousness in the undefined and open throat. And I think one of the ways to really wield this spaciousness is to not try to speak too fast, or not try to jam pack all this information, and rather let it be an experience where the audience can not only listen to what you're saying, but they can also listen to the silence as well as what you're not saying. It's reminding me of something that we say in music all the time, where as a performer, sometimes the silence is as important as what you're playing. What is not being said, the notes that are not played, are as important as the notes that you are playing. And as a classical musician, something that a lot of my teachers really taught me was the importance of honoring that rest, right? When there's a rest in your music sheet, you are supposed to cease all sound production, right? Don't let the pedal be there. If you're playing the piano, don't, sustain the note let there be silence, because silence has impact. And so I think this ability to kind of be in conversation is such a superpower for a lot of people with undefined throat. Um, when we really use our throat, both the physical throat and the energetic throat, to sense into is something wanting to be said in the room, it really shifts our whole orientation to public speaking or to facilitating an experience. I found that my undefined throat loves guiding people through meditations, loves guiding people through hypnosis, loves kind of moving through this experience with people where they can start to fill in the spaces with their own information. And it's important, I think, when you have an undefined throat to not mm, to not be so attached to how people respond to you in the moment. And I think there's nuance here and there's complexity here because as I'm saying this, I'm also recognizing that a lot of this has to do with the state of the nervous system. The nervous system that's able to regulate and that's able to titrate, that's able to come back into that felt sense of I'm inside of my window of tolerance, is able to take a step back, right? Is able to say something and then be like, letting that land almost like in a conscious way. Like there's something kind of trickster about that, right? You're not just jam packing people with information, you're letting them think while you're talking. You know, it can be very hard. It can be very uncomfortable, especially if through your undefined throat, you've learned, especially maybe when you were younger, that not everybody will listen to you, right? Or your words sometimes don't have the same impact as other people who have defined throats. I'm the only person in my nuclear family that doesn't have a defined throat. And let me tell you, friends, it shows. When I'm on family vacation, often I have to say something 2 or 3 times, sometimes 4 or 5 times before everybody starts to listen to me. Especially when I'm saying something that they didn't ask, you know? And I noticed that, for example, when my sister says something, she has a defined throat, it's heard right away, and then to add to that, she's actually a manifester. There is an added layer of like her having this really powerful aura, right? And people just kind of move or mobilize right away when she said something, and that's not my experience. And there's a part of me that I think has had to really be with the sadness, the grief, maybe even the rage and the fear of not being heard, and letting that be there and letting myself feel those feelings, you know and recognize that was part of my experience, that still is part of my experience sometimes, right? um and it's painful when that happens, because there are times when I spoke up and I really want people to hear me. I really want people to have a response to me. um and also, you know a huge part of my deconditioning process has been um having a podcast, teaching my students, doing one-on-one readings with people, where I'm able to have consistent practice with my voice. I get to consistently share my thoughts. I get to consistently shape my thoughts, right? And to start treating communication as the skills that they are. This is an experiment that is still ongoing. But I have this theory that it's very important, especially for people with undefined or open throat, to learn and to experiment with how to speak in a way that feels really good for them. So rather than, listening to this advice, which again is not 100% wrong, right? But I think it's just when we start to use it as a dogma, or we start to relate to it in a dogmatic way, can be really harmful, of wait until someone asks you a question or wait until someone signals that you can speak up, right? Yeah, I really don't know about that advice because I feel like that's not been true for me. I found that giving myself permission to talk and to practice not being super attached to how other people receive my words, because the reality is when you have an undefined throat, things don't land the same way as for people who have defined throat. You might not see people mobilizing right away, right? There's a lack of impact that the undefined centers have. And so the undefined center is more receptive, right? It's much more absorbing and amplifying back. And so, um, yeah, I think that giving ourselves permission to speak up and to um, practice using our voice and to see when does it feel good for me to use my voice? When does it feel like forcing? When does it feel painful? Sometimes even to use the voice, and to learn from those experiences, I think is really important in the deconditioning process. Um, yeah, I think there's also something to the undefined throat that can be really beautiful, which is that we get to share things um, in a way that sometimes doesn't offend, even if what we're saying is really pointed. So I've noticed this a lot in teaching. Like sometimes I would say something that I'm like, wow, people are going to get really offended by what I said. But because of my undefined throat, I noticed that it doesn't land for people the same way. Like sometimes they even have to take a moment. Maybe even they come back the next week and they're like, oh, I'm thinking about what you said. It keeps reverberating in my system. I think of undefined or open throat people as more like whisperers rather than shouters. We're more like poets um, rather than like newscasters, right? We are more oriented to and equipped to talk about the context rather than the point itself, right? And so we can really use that to our advantage. I think of a lot of um sages and mystics of bygone eras as having very undefined and open throat way of sharing their messages. For example, you can um, think about the archetype of the teacher, right? The spiritual teacher or the spiritual monk who every time their students ask them very specific questions, they just would start telling stories, right? That's a very undefined throat way of relating, or even Rabbi Yeshua or Jesus sharing all these parables, right? Um, to me, a lot of that is very much open throat style, or that style can be more resonant for us with open or undefined throat. I've also noticed that this is kind of a double-edged sword, but sometimes I don't have to craft my messages super specifically because people who are going to listen to me are going to listen to me no matter what. They're searching for something, and sometimes they think they come to me because they want something, but actually they got something else and they were like, "Oh, I didn't even know that this was what I wanted." So there's kind of a surprise element to it. And then the people for whom my presence, my voice, my message doesn't resonate will just never even come like 50 feet near me. Like it's almost like I can be shouting as loud as possible and they can't even hear me. So I think there's something that can feel really liberating. I think in my process doing this work specifically, it's felt really liberating. But there are also other instances where that's really challenging, right? Like, for example, when I'm releasing my music, there's a part of me that absolutely wants everybody to hear it. I want everybody to share with me their deep experiences of listening to my songs. And I don't always get that. Actually, I very often don't get that, which can be really frustrating as well, right? And annoying. Um, Maybe the last thing that I want to share here is something that Leonard Cohen has said in the past, which is um, essentially that the cracks are where the light comes in, right? A lot of you probably have heard the saying, and I think the same goes with the undefined throat. Because the undefined or the open throat sometimes has this way of explaining or this way of communicating that can feel quite indirect, especially because we're so used to living in a world where most people have a defined throat. And so, with a little bit of training, they can get quite incisive with their delivery and their message. But with the undefined or the open throat, there is a little bit of a crack, right? And I'm reminded of something that my mom actually said to me when I was feeling really nervous about preparing for a specific public speaking opportunity a few years ago, where my friend asked me to come on and to talk about Saturn return, the phenomenon of the Saturn return. And I found myself kind of nervous because the audience um, wasn't like a super astrologically fluent audience. And so there's a part of me that's like, uh-oh, I have to really design what I say because I want to make sure it lands for the specific audience. Like I don't want to start going off the deep end with my astrologer mind and then just kind of lose everybody, right? And then my mom said something that really stuck with me. She said, you know, Jonathan, my favorite teachers are always the teachers who explain things a little bit imperfectly. Because what happens in those moments when someone explains something imperfectly is I get curious because I don't fully know what they're talking about. There's a part of me that goes like, huh, what are they saying? I don't really know what's going on here. And then I would go out and start researching on my own. And in the process of researching, I start to build my own relationship with this knowledge. And that feels so beautiful to me. Like that feels like that's what the role of the teacher is, to inspire their students or whoever they're talking to go out on their own and find out for themselves what is true for them. So I really want to share that with all of you because I think for those of you listening who have an undefined or open throat, you might have this experience of like, oh, I don't think I can ever really be a good teacher or I can ever really be a good speaker because um I don't get that feedback from people, right? I would say, it's really up to you to work on your communication skills. I also, by the way, have Mercury in Pisces in my birth chart, and so Mercury is considered in fall and in detriment by essential dignities in astrology, and Mercury is related to communication, to speaking, right? And so I hear you. I found that throughout my life, I struggle with speaking succinctly. I struggle with speaking in a way that really lands for the average person, so to speak, right? My voice always feels not strong enough or doesn't have enough characteristic or doesn't have enough sass or attitude, right? Um, and it's okay. There is the right way for you to communicate using your voice if that's what you want. And with a little bit of practice, you will get there, and you can be the kind of teacher that allows or the kind of information sharer, speaker that can allow your listeners to have their own relationship with the subjects that you are talking about. Rather than being someone who tells people what to think, you can give people context so that they can learn how to think for themselves. The last thing for real that I want to share here is remember, especially if you study human design, that the throat is never the authority. The throat is never the authority in human design, right? This is very important because chances are, whatever your human design type is, you have an authority somewhere, right? You might have a sacral authority or an emotional authority, splenic authority, ego authority, G authority, right? You might be a mental projector, or you might be a reflector, right? In which case your authority is much more process-based. I guess emotional is also process-based. But the throat is never the authority. So I think that's really important for us to remember, because we always, no matter our type and no matter, regardless of whether we have a defined or undefined or open throat, we will always have to rely on some other center in order to make the decision that feels aligned with us. Our truth resides in some other part of our body graph. It's never the throat. So I'm going to leave you with that. And one way to think about it, as maybe in layman's terms, is that you can never control how what you say lands for the other person. For example, I'm speaking to you right now and I don't know what you're doing, right? Because I'm speaking to a podcast. You might be washing the dishes. You might be cleaning the car. You might be driving your kids to school. You might be alone in your bath, right? And some part of how you receive the information and the insights and the experiences that I share through this episode will be determined by what's happening with you right now. And so as someone who has an undefined or open throat, it makes a lot of sense that you carry some feelings of unbelonging or burden, because you've experienced that through the center. You've also experienced pushing yourself, being in your not self, and then feeling really bad about it. But that doesn't mean that when something doesn't land for the other person, it's completely your fault, or there's even anything you can do to influence that, right? Because you never really know what's going on with the other person. So I think that the best advice that I've ever given myself with regards to my undefined throat is to give myself the permission to speak at my own pace, to share through my voice at my own pace, to speak in my own way, and to let that be enough, and to continue to remind myself that that's enough. All right, that is it about the undefined and the open throat. I hope that this has been fascinating for you. I hope this has sparked some understanding or knowing. I would really love to hear how this is landing for you. If you want to support the podcast, you can write a review. You can give us some reviews and what's the word I'm looking for? Ratings on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. All of that is super, super helpful for getting the word out there. And your review can literally be 2 to 3 sentences. It doesn't have to be long. But if what I've been sharing on this podcast has been impactful for you in some shape or form, I would really love for you to support the podcast in that way. It would mean a lot to me. What else? If you want to work with me one-on-one, I will be available. I have some space in September, and I would love to see you for an astrology reading or divination reading, or doing some energy work together. I think that's it from my undefined throat. It's time to rest. It's time for me to sleep. And thank you for listening. And I hope that you have a beautiful rest of your day, rest of your week. And I'm sending you so much love. Thank you. Take care.